if we keep this story in context, remember Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and he's invited those who have been following him to go to Jerusalem with him, knowing what will happen there. So the context is this journey that Jesus is undertaking from Galilee to Jerusalem. It might be much like our own life journey. So keep that connection to that context in mind. The question that's raised comes from someone in that community who does hold a position of prominence, power, and prestige. And so that privilege that he has leads him to ask the question that really is a legitimate question for someone of his persuasion, a lawyer, to ask. What does it take to be free or to find this life that God has promised us? Maybe not so much life in the future after death, but how do we live in this life of God, presuming that it is a life of freedom? And so Jesus, kind of in the way that, at least in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, well, what's your take on the law? So what he's asking is, and as I heard the preacher this morning, we're asked to interpret the law. And like any law or rule, there can be many different ways to interpret the law and the rule. Literally, figuratively, spiritually, physically, whatever it might be. So there's freedom of interpretation. And so Jesus says, well, what do you take on this? The man says, and it was probably the prayer that he would pray almost every day, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, the Lord alone. Therefore, you shall love the Lord your God with your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength. That comes from the book of Deuteronomy. So in a sense, he's quoting a core text in the Jewish tradition. And then the addition, always in the text, is to tie it to the book of Leviticus, where it says, love your neighbor as yourself. So the way that we live in the world is first with reference to God. So the question of how do we call God or who is God is a very critical question to have. But it also then means that once we come to a way of understanding God, that it then isn't just an idea or an intellectual pursuit, but rather it's how do we live in the world in conformity with that understanding of God. For that, there might be many interpretations. And so it's interesting, as the story proceeds, the man, and in some of the texts, he's looking around at his buddies who have joined him, and in order to be justified in their sight, he presses Jesus to say something about who neighbor is. Now, I have to think that given his position, his privilege, his power, he may interpret neighbor as being people who are like himself. In other words, from their saying, why would somebody who is in a privileged position with all of the social benefits that come from that privileged position want to associate with somebody who's not in that social class? Why would you want to do that? Because you've already perhaps judged that people who are not in your social class have nothing to contribute, have nothing to offer, and are probably not worth or valued very much at all. And so the challenge will come is to how this individual asking this question, interpreting the law, how he is going to now navigate the parable as it's told, to figure out how who neighbor is. Jesus tells a story, and it's interesting, again, that each of the people that come along, the first two people anyway, are also people of privilege privilege and power, right? The priest and the Levite, they have a certain social position, they have a social location, they have a group of people around them in a sense. And so the thought is, why would they want to stop and care for someone in the gutter if they've already judged that that person is not, they're not going to be comfortable with them because they're not dirty, unclean, and perhaps diseased? How do you know, right? So that the challenge comes in that sense. So the man who asked the original question probably would first identify with these guys. They're people of privilege, they're people of power, so obviously this person in the gutter is not a neighbor or should not be associated with. Along comes a Samaritan. Now, as I think about it, in the Gospel of Luke, the community of Luke is one who is struggling with their position and their privilege and their power. They're educated people, they're probably middle class to upper middle class people. So they're quite comfortable with associating, going to dinner parties and cocktail parties and attending happy hour wherever they're quite comfortable in that world. When somebody from outside comes into their midst, do you think they're going to gather around that person and engage them in conversation and engage close physical? No, they probably will, like parting the waters. They're going, oh, this guy doesn't have the right clothes on. This guy kind of smells funny. You know, this person looks a little weird, hasn't shaved in 2 days probably. So it's like parting the waters. They don't want to have anything to do with them. Along comes someone who within the community of the day, of Jesus's day, would be the last person that you would think of who's going to show what Torah practice is really about. Because the judgment on the people within the privileged circle of Judaism of the day would not have had anything to think worthwhile in associating with Samaritans. We hear this later in the story of the woman at the well that Jesus engages in conversation. She's an outsider, one of suspicious character. So how is it that Jesus is associating with somebody who, in the legal bounds, social bounds, economic bounds, how is Jesus associating with somebody who we've already judged to have no power, no value, no worth, no privilege at all? The Samaritan comes along, and it's clear that the practice of this man, compared to the other two, is without question, he stops, he cares for him, he uses perhaps expensive oil and wine to wash the wounds of the man. He even bandages the wounds in his way. He puts them on his own donkey, and he says, let's go and get you taken care of. No questions are asked by the man in the gutter. No second thinking about it. He does it without question, without hesitation, without pause. What's interesting is that when Jesus comes back and asks, well, who is neighbor to the one in the gutter? You see, I think we miss this connection, that often it's thought that we should associate with the Samaritan. But in effect, I think it's so telling us who's neighbor to the one in the gutter means that we have to move to put ourselves in the position of the person in the gutter in order to understand what the challenge of being a neighbor is about. That's hard for any of us who have privilege and position and prominence in the community, to think that we should first associate with the ones who are not privileged, who are judged by society to have no value or worth, or to be just looking terribly disgusting, smelling, and so forth. To put ourselves in relationship to that person in the gutter. Because it's easy to give out charity and keep it at an arm's distance, right? But it's even more difficult to associate, to think that we've got to have a relationship. with people who are in that position. What one of us would think that we need to have a relationship with people who have no power, who have no position, who are not people of privilege, who associate with the wrong folk, and who are dirty and unclean. The Good Samaritan story is the suggestion as the man, and in one situation when this question is asked in Mark's Gospel, the man goes away sad because he can't give up what he has to associate with the one who hasn't anything. And Jesus is sad about it. So here we are in a time where our own privilege and our own position within the community asks us to interpret the law in such a way that it is not so literal at face value, but rather is an attempt to move us past an interpretation of the law that asks us the question, what is more important, or what should be the biggest priority for us? Is it the maintenance, the keeping of the law, or is it the mercy, the compassion, the willingness to go out of one's way, to have a relationship with those who in society are not people that we would choose, first of all, to have a relationship with? It's easy to pass by, and I think how I feel anyway, if I can speak a moment of a person, is it's overwhelming. It's like, for every one person that you try to help, there's 10 more people that you need to help. And there's only seemingly so much resources. Quite a number of years ago, I was in Chicago, and when I was in school in Chicago, when we went down into the loop it was at Christmas time to see the Christmas lights in Chicago. And as happens in many places, somebody came up and said, could you give me some money? I immediately judged the person because I could smell alcohol on his breath, and decided, because he asked, could he have money for food? And I decided on my own, well, if he's asking for food, I'll go find some food. And there happened to be several vendors out in the cold in Chicago selling apples and things like that. So I went over and I bought a couple of apples, and I came back to the fellow and I said, here, you asked for food, money, I'm giving you food that you said you would use the money to buy food. And he looked at me and he said, that's not what I wanted. And I thought, well, how dare you? I'm giving you what you said you wanted the money for. How dare you reject it? And I felt kind of self-righteous that I had followed through in providing something for this individual. He rejected it. Well, that's his problem, no longer my problem. When I told that story later on to somebody, they said, you know, what you just did is you didn't allow that individual a free agency of self-respect and dignity to make the choice for themselves. You took it away from them. And you decided what was right for that person, rather than letting that person decide for themselves. So one thing in this, and that bothered me every time afterwards, of how I managed to respond to somebody like that individual in the gutter who's asking for something. I make the judgment on what I think is right for that person, rather than letting that person decide for themselves. So maybe instead of taking away the agency of those who are in that position, honor them with dignity and respect, and to give them the freedom to operate out of their own humanity that will enable them to have that dignity and respect that as human beings they deserve to have. Who is the neighbor for us? Again, if we see God in a certain way, then the challenge of that view of God is to act and practice it in such a way that we also respect the dignity and integrity of others. But we do the act of compassion without any of the strings attached to it. Which is one of the things, and I'll make this the last one, is we'll give you aid, but you have to work. You have to do something for what we're doing, rather than giving freely of the generosity and letting the individual decide what they will do. We attach many strings to our charity and to our social justice and social work. That doesn't really allow us to respect the dignity and integrity of the one in the other. Who is neighbor? Are we willing to pass by and not give second thought to it? Do we do what we do with the same honor and respect and dignity for those most in need? The more questions to consider. Let us offer our prayers and our needs today